From Tonka trucks for Christmas, to furniture for the living room, to delays of all kinds of products from around the world. Blame it on the supply chain.
Executives and experts about the global supply chain in 2025. Majority think supply chain disruptions will get worse before they get better.
Some launches have been pushed back, whether it be because of ingredient shortages or packaging delays.
Can't find products to stock the shelves of your small business. Can't find holiday gifts. Well, it's all because of the global supply chain crisis that's happening right now.
Think about the last time something was suddenly out of stock. Maybe it was toilet paper, maybe it was baby formula, maybe it was a specific medication, or maybe it was something a bit less dramatic, a part you needed, a shipment delayed, a product that simply wasn't there. Most people moved on when the shelves restocked, filed it away as a blip, just a bad week for logistics. But those moments weren't random, because the global supply chain, the system that keeps store shelves full and packages arriving in 2 days, is much more fragile than it appears. And the more efficient it becomes, the more exposed it gets. In early 2020, people started buying toilet paper, not because there was a shortage, but because they were afraid there might be none. And then, because everyone was buying it, there was none. That feedback loop, fear creating the very scarcity it feared, felt absurd in the moment. A panic, an overreaction, but it was actually a preview. What happened with toilet paper wasn't a quirk. It was the system behaving exactly as designed, tightly wound, low on slack, sensitive to pressure. And toilet paper is one of the more simpler products in the chain. Once you start looking at the more complex ones, the picture becomes much harder to ignore. Picture a single cotton t-shirt. The cotton was grown in Texas, spun into yarn in Bangladesh, woven into fabric in China, cut and sewn in Vietnam, tagged and packed in Cambodia, loaded onto a container ship in Ho Chi Minh City, unloaded in Los Angeles, trucked to a distributor center in Ohio, and delivered to your door in 2 days. That shirt likely crossed at least 6 countries before you put it on. It arrived on time because every single handoff, every border crossing, every loading dock, every shipment lane worked exactly as planned. That's not just logistics, it's coordination on a scale that most of us never think about. When a system depends on that level of precision, even small disruptions don't stay small. Over the last few decades, companies adopted a philosophy called just-in-time production. Instead of storing large inventories in warehouses, companies receive parts and materials exactly when they need them, not weeks early, not months in advance. It reduces storage costs, improves cash flow, and makes balance sheets look cleaner, but it also removes cushion from the system. If one shipment is delayed, production slows. If one supplier fails, assembly lines stall. If one port shuts down, entire industries feel it. And because so many industries share the same shipping routes, transportation hubs, and narrow choke points, a distribution rarely stays local. It moves through the system. In 2021, the world got a very uncomfortable reminder of what that looks like. On March 23, 2021, a cargo vessel called the Ever Given ran aground in the Suez Canal. It blocked one of the most critical trade routes in the world. For 6 days, it didn't move. Over 400 ships were delayed. Roughly $9 billion in goods was being held up each day. Factories waited for components, retailers waited for inventory, consumers waited for products. One ship, 6 days. Measurable global impact. And that was simply a contained event, one with a clear endpoint. The COVID-19 pandemic showed what happens when there isn't one. Factories shut down in one country, and manufacturers in another couldn't get parts. Ports became congested. Shipping costs surged by hundreds of % on some routes. Everything from bicycles to baby formula became scarce, and not because demand disappeared, but because the pipeline feeding that demand fractured in multiple places at once. And in some industries, that vulnerability had been building for years before anyone even noticed. In 2021, car dealerships ran out of cars, not because of steel shortages, not because of labor shortages, because of a chip smaller than your thumbnail. Semiconductors are in your phone, your car, your appliances, your medical devices. Over time, manufacturing consolidated into a handful of companies, most of them out in Taiwan and South Korea. Efficient, specialized, cost-effective, until demand surged, and then there was no room to flex. Automakers paused entire production lines because they couldn't source a relatively inexpensive component. Used car prices rose sharply. The auto industry lost an estimated $210 billion in revenue in 2021 alone. The vulnerability wasn't created in a single year. It was the result of decades of concentration. The same logic repeated quietly across industry after industry. So, when production consolidates, risk consolidates with it, and you don't notice it until the shelf is empty. Here's the trade-off. Efficiency makes goods cheaper. Resilience makes systems stable. But resilience costs money. Backup suppliers, excess inventory, diversified production. For decades, the incentives favored efficiency. And it worked. Until it didn't. The system became extraordinarily good at functioning under normal conditions, and extraordinarily brittle under stress. When supply chains tightened, when shelves emptied and prices spiked, the impact wasn't evenly distributed. If you have savings, you absorb the increase. If you have options, you find alternatives. Not everyone does. The 2021 baby formula shortage followed the shutdown of a single manufacturing facility. One factory disruption led to months of nationwide scarcity. For families with resources, it meant driving further or paying more. For families without them, it meant rationing feedings, calling hospitals, borrowing from strangers online. The more centralized a system becomes, the more its failures fall on the people with the fewest options. We've built a system optimized for speed and cost. We didn't build it for durability, and when it strains, it does not strain evenly. The supply chain is often described as a network, interconnected, distributed, resilient. In practice, it behaves much less like a net and more like a tightrope, stable as long as nothing pushes too hard. And the forces that can push are everywhere. A labor strike, a regional drought, a geopolitical dispute, a cyber attack like the one that hit shipping giant Maersk in 2017, disrupting operations across 76 ports worldwide. The system rarely collapses outright. It does strain, costs do rise, delays accumulate, and shortages appear, but then it adjusts. But each time it strains, it reveals how interconnected everything is, and how much we depend on the entire system working at once. A factory fire in Japan ripples into car production in the United States. A drought in Brazil shifts coffee prices in Europe. A diplomatic dispute reshapes shipping routes globally. The world is much more connected than ever, and that connection is a feature until it becomes a fault line. But are things changing? In recent years, governments and companies have started taking resilience more seriously, reshoring certain industries, stockpiling critical goods, diversifying supplier bases, investing in domestic semiconductor production. These are real efforts, but they're slow, expensive, and politically complicated. Resilience doesn't produce the same short-term returns as efficiency. It doesn't show up cleanly in quarterly earnings. It functions more like insurance, and insurance rarely feels urgent until after the loss. The shortages of 2021 generated headlines and pledges. As shelves refilled and prices stabilized, urgency faded. But the incentives that created the fragility, those are mostly still in place. The question isn't whether the system will face another shock, because it will. The question is whether this time it'll be better prepared to absorb it. The global supply chain is not on the verge of collapse, but it is tighter than it looks. More concentrated than most people realize. More dependent on narrow choke points and single points of failure than we're comfortable admitting. Think again about that t-shirt. 6 countries, 1,000 handoffs, a container ship crossing the Pacific, a truck driver on a deadline, a warehouse worker scanning a barcode at 3 a.m. All of it working invisibly so that 2-day delivery feels like a given. It really isn't a given, it's a choice. To build for speed instead of stability, to optimize for cost instead of resilience. And somewhere right now, there's a shipment that's delayed, a production line waiting on a component, a decision being made about where to cut costs next, and eventually, a shelf that reflects those decisions. The next time something you expect to be there simply isn't, don't just write it off as a glitch. Ask what it's connected to. The answer might surprise you. But let me ask, where have you felt this in your own life? A shortage, a delay, something that made you realize how dependent we are on systems that we rarely see? Let us know down in the comments below.